from around the world. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Say It With Science, Climate Change and the Threat to Our Health. My name is Kira Peikoff, and I'm the editor-in-chief of leaps.org, a magazine that covers scientific innovation, ethics, and the future of humanity. I'll be hosting and moderating today's discussion with climate scientists, health experts, and youth activists. In a moment, we'll dive into how climate change is impacting our mental health, our physical health, and what this means for our future. As many of you know, today's event is taking place alongside COP26, the first in-person gathering of global climate activists since the start of the COVID pandemic. Never before in any of our memories has the health of our planet and our people been so critical and so intertwined. By the end of this hour, we hope you will have a better understanding not only of how our health is being impacted by climate change, but what leaders and advocates are doing about it and what you can do about it too. For our first conversation, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Susan Clayton and Xiye Machani. Dr. Clayton is a professor of psychology at the College of Wooster and a visiting fellow at the Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme and Paris Institute for Advanced Studies. She's also an IPCC contributing author. And Xiye Machani is the convener of the UN Foundation Next Generation Fellows. So let's just dive in. Dr. Clayton, let's start with the basics. How would you define the relationship between what's going on with our climate crisis and our mental health? What does the science tell us?
Well, climate change can affect mental health in multiple ways. I think a lot of people would recognize that the extreme weather events that are increasing because of climate change are also associated with mental health impacts. So if you live through a hurricane or a wildfire, there are statistically significant increases in post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, things like that. We also have increasing evidence that rising temperatures can also be a threat to mental health. And then finally, there's increasing attention to a phenomenon that's been called climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, which is the anxiety and stress that results simply from awareness that climate change is occurring.
So last year, my magazine, leaps.org, actually reported on the connection between mental health and the climate crisis. And we spoke to a number of therapists who said that they lacked resources for helping their clients with this kind of stress. Are you seeing any kind of change in that area for helping people deal with the situation?
I absolutely think people are more aware of the problem. So most psychologists are not trained to think about environmental issues very much. But as you say, more and more mental health professionals are reporting that their clients are talking to them about these concerns. So there is some research and some attempts to consider what kinds of therapies might be most appropriate for clients like that. But also mental health organizations are beginning to think about how they can better prepare the therapists to respond to these kinds of concerns.
And Xiye, we know that young people are set to inherit this climate crisis and that there's about 10 billion people yet to be born this century who will also, unfortunately, inherit this crisis. How are you seeing this issue impact your peers' mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's most alarming about some of the natural disasters that we're seeing today is that we know that the frequency and scale is just going to increase as global temperatures continue to rise. And I personally think it's taken a significant toll on my peers' mental health. I mean, it's quite a bleak prospect. I think as human beings, we're kind of fundamentally programmed to think about the future, about the legacy that we'll leave and what we pass on to our children and grandchildren. And I think if we can't feel optimistic about the future, which is, I think, the situation that we're in now, it's really hard to motivate oneself to, motivate oneself to continue fighting for climate action.
Yeah, it's a really daunting challenge for sure. So Dr. Clayton, since everyone may be experiencing different kinds of mental health related impacts from this climate change, whether it's that they have pre-existing mental health conditions or they're living in a community that's vulnerable to the effects of climate change, how do we get people the help they need since there's no one approach that fits everybody?
Well, I think one of the most important things is for people to recognize that it's reasonable and common for your mental health to be affected by climate change. So in many societies, we have a stigma about seeking mental health support, and people should not feel that kind of stigma. It doesn't necessarily have to be a mental health professional, though. There are lots of ways to get help. I think a very useful first step is for people to talk to other people about the anxieties they're feeling, just so they have the chance to share their concerns and get some validation.
And do you think that the world leaders who are being pressed to act are aware or learning more about the impacts on mental health?
I think they should be. I think that there's more and more news reports out there that are talking about these mental health impacts. And I know that in a recent opening of the UN General Assembly, the Secretary General made some reference to some of these findings, especially with regard to young people. So I know that some world leaders are aware of these concerns. And I hope that more of them will be mindful of it. I think when we start to think about the moral implications of older generations leaving this situation for younger generations who aren't personally responsible for it, we become aware of how important it is to provide them with at least support to maintain mental health.
Absolutely. And Aish, we know that you were deeply involved in the creation of Our Common Agenda, which was the companion piece to the Secretary General's Our Future Agenda report. Better support of mental health for students was also included, and you've been engaged in mental health advocacy on campus. Where do you think support is lacking now, and how can the young people advocate for themselves, since it is seen somewhat as a taboo to deal with this topic?
Yeah, I mean, just a point of clarification, it was the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, and we supported with Our Future Agenda, but not to worry. I mean, just to, I think as Dr. Clayton was saying, we have actually seen some progress on this. The fact that the Secretary General brought this up in the UN General Assembly was really great progress. But I think one place where it's lacking is I think people don't necessarily understand the toll of really just what it's like to be a young person who's fighting for causes. I think a lot of people will dismiss the mental toll of activism because it's seen as a choice. But actually, I think a lot of the young people that are fighting for this better world don't really see it as a choice. They see it as the fact that they've been let down by leaders and who are failing to act urgently, and they feel like they need to take on this role. And I think that's something that's not really spoken about. And in terms of it being a taboo, I think we've come a long way since then. I raised money for Movember, and that's a really brilliant charity that does a lot to support the mental health of young men, where actually there's a lot of stigma around, talking about your feelings and things amongst young males. And that's really great progress. But actually, I think even now, when you bring up mental health as a reason for not doing something on campus or like struggling with work, it's still kind of seen as a weakness. And I think if we start to see it as the classic thing of seeing it on the same terms as physical health, then that will really change the way that we think about it.
Yeah, those are really important points. Now, this may sound contrary given the discussion so far, but we have noticed a new term rising up in the last year or two, which is climate optimism. And I think especially young people really need to feel some sort of light at the end of this tunnel so that we can continue to be motivated to fight for change and to feel that our advocacy is going to have a real impact. Do either of you consider yourselves climate optimists, even in the face of the massive challenges we are dealing with today?
I'll let Aish respond first.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I mean, I think I would say yes, because without being slightly optimistic, I don't think I could convince myself to continue advocating for, climate action and continue working with some brilliant young activists across the world. And I mean, Dr. Clayton will kind of, assure me on this, but the science says we can do it, and it's really just a matter of mobilizing and actually doing it. So I think I would say I am, but that sometimes I think it's fair to say that it is hard to keep that in mind sometimes when the odds seem against you.
Understood.
I'll make a couple of comments if that's all right. One is that I think it absolutely is important to have some sense of optimism or hope, and some people make a distinction between those two things, but at least have the sense that it's possible that things will turn out okay, that, not be convinced we're all doomed. A second, though, is that this optimism can coexist with anxiety. So one doesn't preclude the other. I think a lot of people have these very complicated sets of emotions that they feel in response to climate change.
That makes sense. I know the New York Times recently ran an article discussing how extremely narrow our path forward is if we're going to avert the worst of the catastrophes that have been predicted. So reading those kinds of news stories, I'm sure, is very troubling for many people. So how can we encourage other people to become climate optimists?
Well, seeing what other people are doing, I think, is one of the most important things. It's very inspiring. And in fact, a lot of people, when they're asked about their emotions in response to climate change, they'll talk about being inspired by what others are doing. And I'm certainly inspired by the work of young climate activists in this topic, and making sure to share those stories at an individual level and at sort of social media level, so that more and more people are aware that people are coming together to address this.
Yeah. And Aish, do you have any advice for people who are looking for some source of optimism or hope in spite of the anxiety they're carrying around?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just completely second that. I think it's really easy to get down because of all the doom and gloom stories about the climate, but actually there is a lot. We have made significant progress. As much as action has been slow, I think if we hadn't cooperated and converged in the way that we have around climate, we could have been in an even worse situation than we are. So I think it's definitely worth celebrating the progress that has been made. And even if those stories are hard to find, I think it's worth looking for them. And maybe just like we as society and media in particular should do a better job of highlighting those kind of narratives, as much as it is obviously important to urge action.
Great. Well, thank you so much for both of you for joining us today. It's so essential that we shed light on the connection between climate-related crises and our mental health burden, and how we can move forward, hopefully, to a much better path for everybody. I hope this is only the beginning of the education and action on this issue. So thank you both again.
Thank you for drawing attention to this issue. It was really a pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the chance to speak here. It's been a pleasure to speak to you both.
Next up, I am incredibly honored to be joined by Dr. Maria Neira, Director of Public Health, Environment, and the Social Determinants of Health at the World Health Organization. Dr. Neira, thank you for joining us. We just had a great conversation with an IPCC contributing author and youth leader on the mental impacts of climate change. So we'd love to chat with you now on the physical impacts and the big picture overall, especially given COP26 happening. So the WHO just released its special report on climate change and health. Can you give us the top line, most pressing points of the report?
Yeah, thank you. And we tried on the report to do something important. We tried to put a positive emphasis on that, because what we are saying is that in that report, we are presenting the health arguments for more climate action. What that means that whenever you tackle the causes of climate change, you will have enormous and immediate health benefits. Most of them will come from the reduction of air pollution. And let me put a figure here, which is horrible, but we need to repeat it. Every year, we have 7 million unacceptable premature deaths caused by exposure to air pollution. And you see, the causes of air pollution and the causes of climate change, somehow they overlap on a 75%. Those causes are essentially the burning of fossil fuels. And we need to change that. So we can have enormous benefits for health, for the health of the people, reducing that air pollution. The other benefits will come from healthier diets, from a more sustainable food systems, and the other amazing benefits will come from more active lifestyle, less sedentary lifestyle, and therefore less traffic, less accidents. Imagine, it will be so positive, so common sense, so logical, and as a society, something very, very healthy.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's a really staggering and horrible statistic that you mentioned about air pollution. So we have a chicken and egg conundrum, right? Because we have to prepare our health system for the challenges of meeting the needs of these people. But we also need to very urgently create and innovate reliable new sources of cheap, plentiful energy so that we can shift away from fossil fuels and protect the air quality. So how should we press leaders to incentivize the innovations that we crucially need?
Yeah, thanks for emphasizing this point on adaptation. No matter what we'll do, and no matter how ambitious and engaged there will be the leaders at the COP26, we still need to do something to adapt to what climate change is doing to our health, particularly the health of the most vulnerable, the ones that are not responsible for the causes of climate change. The climate change is already touching the three pillars of our health: food production, the quality of the air we breathe, and the quality of the water we drink. When you touch that, imagine that for our health, a disaster, and therefore is a public health emergency. But in addition to adaptation, yes, we need to do three transitions. Healthy energy transition quickly, as soon as possible, moving to renewable sources of energy, clean sources of energy, whatever it takes. Most of the technology is already there, but we need to make sure that everybody will use that technology and they will have access to that. Second, healthy urban transition. We need to change our cities, our urban environments. We need to make it more livable cities and then reduce the terrible situation we have now in our cities where instead of being protected, we are at risk. And the third transition is the food transition, these sustainable food systems, and stop the war we have with nature. We need to stop destroying and polluting everything we touch, everything, the rivers, everything we touch. So the air we breathe, and that's really not very intelligent. So focus on the positive arguments, the health arguments for climate action, and I'm sure that the economy will be better, the health will be better, the society will have less mental health problems, and we will recover on a logic and perfect and harmonious and hopefully even fair way.
Thank you. Well, amen to that. I hope that we are able to accomplish all of those, but it's of course extremely difficult when countries are facing potential economic short-term problems if they have to shift away immediately from fossil fuels to curb emissions. So it's a really tricky problem for a lot of countries.
Well, that's why we call it transition. It's a transition, but no excuses, because in fact, for those countries where they don't have yet this massive development, it's wrong to think that if you want to develop economically, you need to destroy your environment. At the contrary, you will have a better economic development if you protect your environment, if you move in something more sustainable, more cleaner and less polluting sources of energy. And that will be good to create new jobs, green jobs. That will be good to reduce the horrible cost for our health system that this combustion of fossil fuels is representing, filling our hospitals with chronic respiratory diseases, with cancer, lung cancer, and affecting our body in so many ways that is very costly for the society. So no argument. Of course, we will need some little time. The question is, more we prolong on time, more lives we will be on our shoulders. I mean, more deaths on our shoulders. The quickest we do it and the ambitious we do it, then we will save more lives.
Do you think that societies are currently optimized right now to promote innovations or encourage innovations into alternative sources of fuel, for example, nuclear fusion and other types of clean energy? Is there enough resources going into that kind of innovation right now?
Well, if you listen to those working on renewable sources of energy, they are telling you that the technology is there, the trend is very positive. We could have moved on a more ambitious way. If you listen to those countries where they are already taking very ambitious decisions, where they are phasing out coal, I think it's a question of putting the right political pressure at the right moment And again, putting the health consequences up front to accelerate those decisions. Sometimes when your decisions are based on protecting the environment, maybe you don't feel the urgency. But when your decisions need to be taken because your health is so much affected, because all of those millions of deaths we were talking about, because the fact that many people will be now displaced, there will be difficulties on agricultural production, there will be lack of safe water in many places. Come on, migration, displacements. This is an emergency. This is urgent. So the economic argument is very balanced. We can advance on our economies, even if we take those decisions that needs to be taken and we move on to this transition in the name of our health.
So speaking of that kind of political pressure, on November 6th, WHO is holding the Global Conference on Health and Climate Change. What do you hope will be the result from this conference? And how can experts like yourself actually help to push for this really needed change?
I think until now, this agenda of climate change has been in the hands, logically, of the environmental ministers of foreign affairs. I think now we need to take this as a public health emergency as well. And, then the timing will be different. It's not the same when you need to take a decision that will protect biodiversity. If you don't see that this lack of biodiversity is affecting your health, maybe you don't have that sense of emergency. So WHO will be there to say, this is affecting our health, first point. This is affecting it on a huge way. This is a public health issue, very big one. It's killing 7 million and the number is increasing. And there are many positive arguments. If you take the right decisions, you will be doing an incredible benefit to public health. You will reduce the cost of our system. You will make something that will give you fantastic opportunities for recovering your economy on a healthy and protecting the well-being of your people, and therefore creating even more jobs and a fair transition. So I think health has to take a very strong role here. The health community is getting very impatient. We have 45 million health professionals signing and backing our report for the health argument for climate action. And I think we cannot ignore the health argument. People is now very sensitive after COVID-19. I think they feel it, that they cannot be vulnerable as we were when the pandemic started.
And I do think the pandemic has put public health on the map in a way that for many people it really wasn't before. I think you've really raised some important points. I hope that people listening are able to really comprehend the immediate health threats of climate change in addition to those from the pandemic.
It's clear that the population now is very sensitive to the health argument. You feel very unprotected. You feel very vulnerable. You felt that because of your health, the whole economy was paralyzed, the world was paralyzed. So I think now that there is much more attention. I don't know for how long we will be able as a society to keep it, but I think we have science and we have very strong arguments demonstrating that if you protect your people from a health point of view, the society is going to be even better. Now, we saw as well that in the big cities where air pollution was already present, the lungs of the population were much more exposed, and therefore they were more at risk to develop and be affected by the SARS-CoV-2. At the same time, we saw that those who were exposed to air pollution in the big cities, they were much at risk to have those underlying diseases that will put you at risk. And if you get the virus, you will have a more severe form of that. So many arguments, and in fact, it's all logic. You don't want to have your lungs permanently breathing toxic air that is killing us little by little. So we need to do something about the energy transition in the name of health and very urgently stop giving subsidies to fossil fuels. This is a health matter.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Nera. We appreciate your time and look forward to the positive outcomes from COP.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And next up, I would like to hand the conversation over to the three incredible young leaders: musician Camila Cabello, climate activist Xiye Bastida, and Jerome Foster. COP26 signals an important moment for the youth climate movement. From putting pressure on world leaders to uphold current and new, more ambitious commitments to climate solutions, to ensuring that all climate responses are equitable and just, we are grateful and inspired by the tireless efforts of these youth climate activists. Over to you.
What's up, everyone? My name is Camila Cabello, and I'm so excited and honored to be here today with youth climate justice activists Xiye Bastida and Jerome Foster to learn more about their work and why we're facing such an important moment to protect our Mama Earth. Right now, leaders from across the world, including youth and frontline activists, are coming together to demand urgent and more ambitious action to fight climate change. Many of them are gathering at COP26, the United Nations 26th Annual Climate Change Conference, which is happening right now in Glasgow, Scotland. That's my really bad Scottish accent. Basically, this global conference is a place for leaders from all over the world to come together to make bold commitments to address the climate crisis. Last year, COP was postponed because of COVID-19, which means there weren't as many opportunities for countries to come together and negotiate bigger and bolder climate action, which we really need. While last year's conference may have been postponed, there's no denying that the climate crisis is here. And it's going to affect every single one of us if we don't take hold of this once-in-a-generation opportunity to create real solutions and, honestly, a more beautiful world where we live in harmony and live with nature. We have to hold world leaders accountable to deliver on their commitments, urge them to be more ambitious, and protect the communities that are most impacted by climate change. This planet is our home, our only one, and it's our responsibility to use our voices to protect it. Each and every one of us has the ability to create change. I know it can be overwhelming to figure out where to start, but our collective action makes a big difference. And that's why I'm so excited to be joined here today for a conversation with a couple of my personal heroes who have been on the front lines day in and day out, fighting for climate justice. Xiye Bastida and Jerome Foster, thank you guys so much for being here. I'm so excited to speak with you.
Thank you for having us.
Well, guys, I want to dive right in. We know that climate change is here and already impacting people across the globe. With COP26 happening right now, people are demanding action from world leaders. So what does that really mean? You know, what are we demanding and how can we be sure leaders are hearing us? Jerome, I want to start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we go into COP26, there's a real urge both on the national scale with the US, but also on an international scale. Really what we're advocating for is for one, the end of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry and using just like public dollars to make coal and oil artificially cheaper when solar and wind are actually like the cheapest form of energy already across the globe. Wow. So that's our first demand. And also what we're also demanding is a prioritization of youth and frontline communities at the table when we're making these decisions. Everywhere we look across the globe, whenever we have a diversity of thought and perspectives, whether that's in the boardroom or whether that's in community discussions, when we have frontline communities, indigenous people, people of color, they're showing their perspective and saying, hey, this is how we have lived across the world in our ways, and you can use our knowledge to better solutions. So that's our second demand. And third demand is to stop the construction of coal-fired power plants and also pipelines that go through indigenous communities. So that's our three main demands, but there's a plethora of other solutions that we're advocating for as we lead into COP.
I love to hear you lay it out like that because I feel like so many people are overwhelmed by the climate crisis and are like, we need our politicians to do better, but it's so good to be aware of what exactly we're asking for, like the actual instructions for what we need to be demanding. And, segueing into what you were saying about needing to have youth and indigenous communities and BIPOC communities at the table because they are the ones that are the most impacted. Xiye, I want to take it to you and ask you, can you share with us who will be the most impacted by the climate crisis and what message you're bringing to COP on behalf of Nuestro México lindo querido, a country that is so deeply rooted in culture and indigenous wisdom. Speaking of, I just came back from Oaxaca 2 days ago, which is a state that is 60% indigenous, and spent a lot of time with people there. And it's so beautiful. I loved Xiye in your TED Talk, how you talk about how, sometimes it can be made to seem as if, the climate crisis is happening because you're not taking your reusable bag to the grocery store. When actually it's like collective action and bigger messages that start even in our relationship to nature and our symbiosis with nature, and how it would be so incredible. I'm kind of going on a tangent here. If, in school, we were taught the beauty and the importance of a reverence for nature and taking care of our planet as being part of our humanity. But anyway, back to my first question. What communities are going to be the most affected, and what message are you bringing to COP on behalf of Mexico?
Well, we see that communities are already being affected by the climate crisis, and it's mainly Black and Brown frontline communities, indigenous communities. Jerome touched upon this, but pipelines primarily go through indigenous land. In Mexico, a lot of mines are actually in indigenous territory. And we see that most of the contamination from waste facilities, contamination from electricity generators are all located in Black and Brown communities. And wow. For example, in New York City, 17% of adults in the Bronx have asthma, which is 10% higher than the national average. So we have this problem of environmental racism and environmental injustice that we have to deal with. That's why we talk about climate justice, and people don't really know what climate justice entails. We say it a lot, but what it really means is that the climate crisis exacerbates all other injustices. So if indigenous peoples are already marginalized, this is going to marginalize them even more. And it's actually harming their lands, harming our traditions, harming our culture. You mentioned going to Oaxaca, and I'm from near Toluca. And, when land is lost, when the effects of the climate crisis hit your home, you lose culture and you lose a part of yourself. And I think people don't really know how much that means to us. So our message is to include these communities at the decision-making tables. In the Paris Agreement, we got the 1.5 degree target instead of the 2 degree target of warming, because island nations were represented, because at 2 degrees, they're going to be underwater. So that really shows you the importance of including frontline communities, and youth have to be included because this is a generational injustice. So we represent the future at these conferences.
That is such a great point, because I feel like in mainstream conversations, you hear a lot about the climate crisis, like just the earth is getting hotter. And people maybe necessarily, some people don't feel it in their immediate reality, but they don't realize that everybody is affected by it, because it is at the center of so many other kind of injustices. Environmental racism, like you said, I think that's a really great point. And speaking to what you were saying about these communities that are being most affected, like Black and Brown indigenous communities, and such a great point, the youth, because it's a generational injustice. We are going to have to be carrying this, and our children after that. Jerome, you are the youngest climate advisor for the Biden administration, and a truly incredible example of a young person carving a seat at the table for themselves. What is possible when young people are included in this conversation, and why is that so important? Why is it so important for the youth to be involved?
When we have young people that are part of discussions like this, especially when we're at like the White House or in congressional offices, it creates like a framework for us to have more deep conversations and nuanced conversations about longevity of solutions, and not just the urgency of taking any action possible. Like oftentimes when we talk about climate solutions, especially when it comes into just right now, we're thinking of, whether we just overturn one pipeline. That's not the goal. It's to stop all future pipelines and make sure that we have a status quo that isn't just reversed when we have another person in office. And I think also when we have young people in power, it shows that this isn't just an old person issue, this isn't just a young person issue, but it's intergenerational discussion. And we have to create policies that not only prioritize the past, but also prepares us for the future most adequately, not just in the sense of technology, but in the sense of equity. Because there's a Native American proverb that says that we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, but we borrow it from our children. And when we are asking to borrow it, we have to consult young people. We have to say, hey, what is the future that you're going to go live into? What do you want from it? And really what we want is the same access to clean air and clean water and that promised land that Dr. King advocated for. That promised land doesn't just go to racial injustice. It goes to the very foundation of how we create policies. And there's been so many cases of young people, especially in California, with the creation of a youth advisory council that basically when they had young people, Indian folks, indigenous folks come together and talk about wildfires, they had a plethora of solutions that said, hey, actually, let's tap into that indigenous knowledge and let's tap into young people that have been fighting for climate and include that in how we're going to tackle wildfires next year. And if they had never had young people at that table, they'd never have known about those solutions.
One of my favorite books talking about indigenous wisdom, a book that's changed my life, is called Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know if you guys have read it, but it's so beautiful and has so much. I also remember reading an article in which I think in New Zealand, the Maori people, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they, it was a similar thing where they were finding solutions because these people have been living and existing and living in harmony and in symbiosis with their land for so long. And we really have a lot to learn. Another question for you guys. Mobilization is central to both of your climate activism, mobilization of people, of voices, of votes. And we're seeing our generation mobilize in mass numbers right now at COP26. What's going to be your collective call to action and how can we better support you and the movement?
Well, we're actually planning a strike on November 5th. That is not only going to be, obviously it's going to be really big in Glasgow, but we are organizing it worldwide. It's going to be a global climate strike. And we're also supporting the strike that is being organized by a Glasgow coalition on November 6th. So, just looking at history, we see that direct action, that people on the streets is one of the most powerful ways to make people to pay attention to us. And especially with youth, we are disrupting our civic duty of going to school to call on pay attention to us. So that is just the only thing that we have because we can't vote. We're not included in these tables. So that's why we strike in the first place. But I think it also generates a sense of community. So we invite everyone to join us on both the November 5th and November 6th strikes that are going to happen for climate justice. Something that I was going to say, I was going to say something and then I forgot and then I was trying to chase it and now I remember. I think that something that I love about your guys' work is that I think that you have this message of, both things are true. We are in a moment where it's about to be the damage that we are going to cause is going to be irreversible. And so it's really, it is like there's an urgency to the moment, but there's also a lot of optimism in the fact that we, live life day by day. We don't realize that over the course of hundreds and thousands of years, we really create the narrative. Like humans really shape the narrative. And I think that's why youth, being so important to this conversation is that over time, that's how humanity and civilizations were built. Like nobody had the instruction book. We kind of wrote it and made it along the way. And I think if what we've done now is possible, it's completely possible to shift to a culture where it's sustainable, but also regenerative and this is what ties into the book Braiding Sweetgrass, is that living in symbiosis and in connection with nature is better for all of us. It's better for our minds, our spirit, our soul, our body. It's not just so that my grandchildren are okay. That's maybe hard to feel in the moment. It's really, it's just a way of, I think, feeling less alone and more connected to the world because we're not just, protecting nature. We are nature. And so anyway, that's just something that I just wanted to get off my chest. Because I think I think that's important to talk about too. And okay, my last question for you guys, because I know you guys have a really busy week. Wait, actually, I have a question about your last question. What if we're not, for example, there in person? How do we, for example, in Miami right now, where I am, if there's not a strike, is there
Should I be organizing one? Should I be posting on social media? When I call my politicians and I, call them, when I call these lines to kind of ask politicians to take action, what should I be saying? You know what I mean? Like, what should we be doing? What are a few different ways that we can be involved?
Sure. Yeah. So there's like the policy breakdown. Like over the past couple of weeks, we've been trying to pass an infrastructure bill on climate. And on Thursday, Biden has unveiled that with a 1.75 trillion infrastructure bill, which has about $500 billion just designated for climate justice. So that is like a bill that's already been put in place. So really what's next is for us to continue to push for even more policies that weren't included in this bill. And right. For example, what that really is like advocating for the Green New Deal and advocating for the In Polluters Welfare Act. Those two bills will be transformative. So that's really what, like, if you call a member of Congress, those two bills would be amazing. But if you're in a local community, just if you aren't in Glasgow physically, or if you aren't comfortable going outside, there's an organization called Fridays for Future USA, and they have local chapters all across the United States.
Okay.
So you can get in touch, organize in your community, go out to your local capital district or anywhere that you feel is like a statement that you can make and make your voice heard.
And I feel like for people that are hesitant to kind of get involved in this conversation because it feels kind of daunting or it feels bleak or they read the headlines, basically we're screwed, which we're not. But when people read these headlines, it can be kind of hard to remain optimistic about our future. Xiye, in your TED Talk, you mentioned that since you were a child, your family invited you to love the world. And Jerome, I read that despite this challenging task ahead, you remain hopeful. And we were talking about optimism before. In the face of all that's going on, what makes you both optimistic? Xiye, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I do bring this view and I tell people we have to be stubborn optimists in our fight for climate justice because we are building a better world. We are, trying to protect joy at the end of the day. And if this is the work that we're going to be doing for the rest of our lives, we might as well make it enjoyable. And there's something my dad says that really, resonates with me, which is we don't have to live from the earth. We have to live with the earth. And once you live with the earth and you recognize the beauty of the earth and the beauty of togetherness, I think that really makes you feel like you're grounded in the decisions that you make. And optimism is, really that lens with which innovation and creativity become possible. Because we're still talking about if it's real or not, when in reality, we should be talking about what is the world we can build? What is the world we want to create? So that is how I stay optimistic, and also just with community. And Jerome is such a big part of that community. So I'm so grateful to him and everyone in the movement.
That's awesome. And Jerome, what about you?
Yeah, I'd say that I'm optimistic about a lot of different things. One is about this next decade of just massive action, like of having like not just like organizers, but celebrities like yourself and like people in communities coming together and saying, hey, what do we want this future to look like? What do we want our planet to envision? And how can our ideals not just be like intangible or saying, oh, I love this tree or I love this planet and it's priceless, but actually making it tangible in everything that we do, from our society to our economy to our culture, being rooted in the ideology of sustainability and really, as Xiye always talks about, reciprocity. And that is really crucial in how we move forward. And that's what I'm optimistic about, is also just getting new elected officials that will bring this to fruition. Like in 2020, a lot of people don't know that like young people made up 1 in every 5 vote. That's powerful. Like literally before then, we made up like less than 10%. And politicians are like, wait, something's changing. The politics of the world is changing. And it's because young people are here. And that's what I'm optimistic about, is that generational change of prioritizing not just adults, but also prioritizing youth in the future.
Totally. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that what makes me optimistic as well is, like we were talking about before, it's like our grandparents, our great-grandparents, in hundreds of years, in generations, humanity has changed and evolved so much, so it's like, even if the immediate reality looks a certain way, we can literally, because it has been done, we can create the world that we want to see. The narrative is really in our hands. And I feel really excited. Like I really do. I feel excited when I, read a book like Braiding Sweetgrass and I deepen my own connection with nature, which, talking about, for example, mental health, which is something I'm really passionate about too, like connecting with nature and feeling, and even just spending time outside and connecting with animals. And it's just like we are part of such a gorgeous world. And I think that, sometimes modern society can make us forget that and can make us forget that what we're fighting for is so precious. And I think that makes me really hopeful and makes me really excited about creating a world that our parents haven't seen, our grandparents haven't seen, a world where it's like Xiye says, it's a world of reciprocity where we have respect for other living things. And we are our souls are rich because of that. Jerome, Xiye, thank you both so much for joining me and for sharing your insights. I feel like I've learned so much from this conversation, and I feel like other people will too. And I also feel really inspired. It can be overwhelming to hear, but the reality is that the climate crisis will affect us all and generations to come. But hope isn't lost. This is about saving our planet and our futures and honestly creating a more beautiful world and really taking charge of our narrative. If you're looking for ways to take action, I'm going to encourage all of you to join us and use your social media platforms this week, especially while world leaders are together at COP26 to demand more ambitious climate commitments. Real commitments that can be delivered by our leaders with equity, collaboration, and urgency. If you're looking for what to say or share, start by following Xiye, Jerome, and other youth activists on the front lines and resharing their messages. You can also access resources like the UN's Act Now platform, which will give you quick ways to understand and deepen your individual impact. We all have the power to come together in this moment and help move us towards a better and more beautiful future. Thank you so much, Xiye and Jerome, and thank you guys all so much for listening in.
It's been a pleasure to moderate today's discussion. I hope we've really helped to raise awareness of the mental and physical impacts on our health of climate change, but also that we've inspired you that change is possible for the better when it comes to the right decisions for our future and the right technological innovations. So I hope everybody feels that there is still hope for the future and optimism despite the major challenges that we face. To close us out, I will hand the mic over to Rajesh Merchandani, Chief Communications Officer at the UN Foundation.
Thanks so much, Kira, for leading today's discussion. And thank you to everyone who's joined us, both for tuning in and also for being passionate about our climate. And if you're listening to this on Spotify, thanks also. This is the first time we've turned Say It With Science into a podcast. Thanks, of course, mainly to all our amazing speakers who helped shine a light on how climate change is impacting our personal health and how we can advocate for ourselves and our future during this climate conference, COP26. As we wrap, I want to share a few of the things that I'm taking away from today's conversations. Firstly, there's the science. Just this week, we've reached the grim milestone of 5 million deaths globally from COVID-19. And as Dr. Maria Neira from the World Health Organization told us just now, the science is irrefutable that impacts from climate change, like air pollution, are actually doing as much damage and are only set to get worse if we don't reverse course. So that's the science. Then there's the stress. Whether or not we realize it, our emotional well-being is tied to the health of our planet. It's called climate anxiety. And for many people, it's a very, very real mental health issue that we've got to talk about, right? Thanks to Dr. Clayton and to the UN Foundation's Next Generation Fellow, Aish Machani, for helping break down mental health taboos and advocating for this issue on behalf of all of us. And then we heard about the solutions. It was amazing to hear from global megastar Camila Cabello and leading young advocates Xiye Bastida and Jerome Foster. And Camila really hit home when she said, we're not just protecting nature, we are nature. It was good to hear speakers talk about the need for climate optimism. I'm sure you'll agree. Xiye Bastida told us how she's a stubborn optimist, and Jerome told us that what makes him optimistic is that the politics of the world are changing because young people are here. And you know what? I couldn't agree more. If you've enjoyed this show, let us know. Go to sayitwithscience.org and get in touch with us there, or on all our main social channels where we are UN Foundation. I truly appreciate all of you joining us, especially at this time on this critical journey to build a healthier, more sustainable future for us all. Thanks so much.